I like to take a kind of big picture, grand historical sweep perspective on these things, and one of the things that drew me to the sciences as a young student was what I think of as a grand epic, a journey in self-discovery, really, and that involved, in the early, the Renaissance revolutions in a scientific understanding of the nature of the universe, the astronomical discoveries, of Galileo, building on Kepler and others, and ultimately, profound revolutions in our understanding of the nature of matter, of the nature of the Earth through, great insights coming from geology, Earth's antiquity. Much later, this plate tectonics process that helps shed so much light on the structure of the Earth today. The scientific process, although science by definition is not humanities, there is an important humanistic dimension to that. It's a voyage of self-discovery, and the biological component of that is a fascinating one. So you can think of Darwin's great contribution, and the reason why he's rightly so honored as a towering figure in the sciences is that he represents that moment of great insight into the nature of what was called the mystery of mysteries, species themselves. And although Darwin didn't talk about people, at least in public, he did in his private notebooks. In The Origin of Species, he didn't say much about people. This came later, in his 1870s books. He recognized that this has profound implications for us. And all of his readers knew right away it had profound implications for us. And that was really where all the controversy was then and is still, not surprisingly,
right.
and it has to do with us. So this has to do with a voyage of really self-discovery, self-understanding of, what is the nature of this quite curious primate? And for those who are rather religiously minded, how does an understanding and acceptance of this scientific understanding of this process of evolution of the human species, how does that then become reconciled with their theological worldview? So it's quite an interesting process of discovery, and it's generated a lot of issues for us to really wrestle with.
Right. Well, that's one of the things I've always liked about evolution, is because it is a ever increasing. It's like always, more complex, more interesting, larger. It's like it's this movement upwards is how I see it.
Well, Darwin did see the whole process as a grand tree. Mm-hmm. It's the tree of life. It's a very ancient metaphor, but he saw all of life as ultimately related. And if you think of this tree metaphor with species as the twig tips, and if they're therefore related genealogically through the twigs to the branches, to the bigger branches, to the trunk, that means that all species, this is quite mind-boggling, right? But all species, from bacterium to pine trees, to protists, fungi, birds, various other kinds of animals, humans themselves, that we all share ultimately, common ancestry. And Darwin speculated that he thought that maybe all of life developed from a few progenitors. And he used language like into which the Creator first breathed life. So the door is open for the ultimate origins. And this is also, of course, an exciting field of inquiry in biology, in chemistry, trying to understand the ultimate origins, chemical evolution, ultimately the evolution of life itself. But he then said, but by analogy, to be consistent, by extension, he thought ultimately probably all organisms that have ever lived must have all descended from a single progenitor. species, and that's quite a grand, epic vision.
It is.
And his vision for how the process unfolds, it actually, this is a bit counterintuitive to those that haven't perhaps read Darwin closely, but his process of natural selection actually is envisioned to drive the diversity of life, to generate an ever-burgeoning tree. And the way that occurs is selection really is seen as having two roles. People intuitively can understand how it has a destructive role. Mm-hmm. This is where it's winnowing, it's getting rid of variants. And you might think, well, if that's all there is, how does that generate all of this diversity? How does it generate the tree of life? But Darwin had an intriguing idea that through the process of competition, that there was a kind of ecological division of labor, that selection favors sort of dividing up the resources, the space and the resources that you need to live. And so any given species that is producing variants, well, the variants that compete the least are the most likely to persist. Those that compete the most go to loggerheads with each other. And almost always one or the other will get driven to extinction. This is very much ahead of its time. Darwin was really talking about fundamental principles of modern ecological theory. We would call this today the principle of competitive exclusion, where no two species can coexist in exactly the same niche. If they have exactly the same needs, inevitably one will drive the other to extinction in that locale. There's also, therefore, this goes hand in hand with the sister principle of niche partitioning. The idea that over time, then, organisms are selected to share space by actually diverging in their needs. Well, Darwin's vision of the tree of life is such that the ecological division of labor and the division of resources makes things increasingly different, divergent over time. And in the Origin of Species, this is a lengthy book, 430 some odd pages. There's only one diagram in the whole book. And that diagram illustrates this process. It illustrates the driving of the tree of life by this principle that is really prescient. It is essentially modern ecological theory.
We hear of social Darwinism, and that's where taking that, what you call the destructive side, the competition and winnowing out, and it's very harsh and cruel, but it's kind of like that's the way capitalism works kind of thing. And so it's intriguing to me to hear about this other side, which can be sounds more like if the separation of the division of labor, as you say. So like, if say I was imagining a bird, I heard about just birds taking different parts of the tree, like maybe a bird likes to be at a mid-level, and then another bird likes to be up at the upper part of the canopy. And so they're sharing the same space, we would think, on the same tree, but they're doing different roles on the same tree.
They at one level of scale, they seem to be occupying the same place. At a finer scale, they're really not. They're not competing very directly. They're confining their foraging to very different parts of the tree. And so that would be a classic example, actually, of this niche partitioning. It's funny you mentioned the bird, the warbler example, because that is considered a kind of textbook example.
It just occurred to me, I didn't know it.
That was actually a very famous study conducted by, now sadly long deceased biologist, died young, Robert MacArthur was his name, who did a detailed analysis of the foraging of wood warblers and showed just how they confine their foraging to different regions of a tree. And they essentially divide up the resource, and they compete very, very little as a result of that.
So could that be seen as more of not cooperation isn't really the right word, but you used it as like not a destructive form of selection.
Yeah, not cooperation, although it is true that certain forms of cooperation can and do evolve by natural selection. I mean, we call this mutualism or symbiosis, where there's mutual assistance to the betterment of both parties. There's many interesting examples of that. This is a process more of not of overtly cooperating, but the de facto result of the lessening of competition is the persistence in that habitat of these two species or varieties or populations, whatever the scale is you might want to look at.
Right, so it's a lessening of competition, because that's what we always think is it's competition is the mechanism. I mean, that's what I had always understood.
And it is, and of course, it is still an ingredient in there, because what's driving the niche partitioning would be the idea that those that don't partition do compete.
Right.
And it's that competition, that's where selection is acting over time. And it's interesting, it's perhaps a semantic issue or maybe a philosophical issue. Is selection acting to lessen competition per se? Well, that's not completely clear, but what falls out of that process is the effect of forcing these populations into different niches, and then iterated over time, these things could become progressively more different from each other. And then you keep iterating that, and you begin to get this branching and rebranching again tree of life. But your point about how we see competition as, or maybe the general public might think of competition as what it's really all about, that's all there is. That is a common view, and you're right that was very much an important ingredient in the thinking of certain social Darwinists. And it's important, I think, to bear in mind that social Darwinism really bears little resemblance to Darwinism. And in fact, Darwin himself really quite disavowed himself of social, what we would call now, what became known as social Darwinian thinking. And it's worth reflecting. It's an irony, actually, that a great criticism leveled against Darwin himself by those very hostile to his views might point to the misappropriation or misapplication of his ideas in a social context. And it's certainly true that some horrific acts have been conducted or perpetrated on the basis of what people said was good Darwinian thinking. But the idea of social Darwinism, which by definition means the application of a kind of Darwinian process specifically to humans and their institutions, often with an emphasis on the competition and such, that was really an idea. It stemmed from a kind of survival of the fittest philosophy that had its origin with the 19th century philosopher Herbert Spencer. Spencer actually coined the idea in I think it was the early 1850s, so before The Origin of Species was ever published. There were some fascinating letters that survive. I mean, in fact, Darwin's correspondence was abundant, and many of those letters are available now online. They've all been published. But in many cases, in the 1850s, 1860s, Darwin is writing to his friends, sort of scratching his head, saying, "What do you think of this Spencer guy? And I don't quite understand what he's getting at, And yet, he would be very upset to find that, in the long run, some of the odious ideas of Spencer, and even Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, who became quite a eugenicist, right? Sort of a founder of the eugenics movement, sort of waved this Darwinian banner and said, this is the essence of Darwinism. It's a great irony, I think, that that Darwin is sometimes seen, because of that conflation of his views with those of Spencer and Galton and others, seen as his ideas, well, it's cruel and heartless. And the irony is that Darwin was what we would call something like a bleeding heart liberal, in his day. His family, they were vehement abolitionists. They railed against slavery, for example. one of his grandfathers was Josiah Wedgwood, the founder of the great Wedgwood pottery dynasty. The Wedgwoods were vehement abolitionists, very, very active. Correspondents with abolitionists in the United States, like Benjamin Franklin and others. And Darwin very much embraced this view. And in The Voyage of the Beagle, you know, he observed the cruelties of slavery in Brazil. He corresponded with Asa Gray, the Harvard botanist, as the Civil War raged, and cursed, you know, the institution of slavery, and really preached much more of a message of amity and equality. There was a great theological debate, you know, in the 19th century between the monogenists and the polygenists. Some of the apologists for slavery and racism argued that the Bible gives us some reason to consider certain groups of people not quite human. The polygenists would suggest that there are humans and there are the not quite humans, and subjugating these not quite humans is perfectly, you know, reasonable and allowed and sanctioned.
It's like having a cow. I mean,
yes, exactly. And the monogenists argued that no, all human races are one. We are one species. We are one people, really. And I just find it rich, you know, that Darwin was a vehement defender of the monogenist view, in arguing for the unity of humanity and needing to treat other people with equality and equanimity. Not to say that he wasn't a Victorian, you know, Eurocentric person. I mean, he had his biases about women and about other cultures. He thought, you know, they were, you know, certainly not as, you know, highly developed as, you know, the European, white European male. But when it came to the essence of morality, of how you treat people, his views were very much at odds with a significant segment of the religious community in his day. And I think that's quite an irony that anti-evolutionists today that, you know, kind of wave the banner of fundamentalism and creationism, they sometimes, well, not sometimes, they often will point to Darwin and equate Darwin with great social evils and ills. And among them are racism and slavery and all of those horrible things, some of which were perpetrated by eugenicists, admittedly in the name of a kind of Darwinian science, but a science that would have turned Darwin's stomach had he lived to actually see that.
Wow.
It's ironic. You know, they were actually arguing that, oh no, you know, these Africans, they're just a different species. And just like our cattle or whoever, it's perfectly fine that we can subjugate them.
Well, and that kind of, it's interesting, brings in that the other person whose 200th anniversary of birth is being celebrated this year is Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, another irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
Born on exactly the same day as Charles Darwin.
Oh, I didn't know it was the same day.
It was precisely the same day, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, February 12th, 1809.
Wow.
Yeah,
Interesting.
very interesting.